Hi everyone, so this is my week 8 data analysis. So one of the most important things I found in our Mills text in chapter 7 was the difference between data analysis and data interpretation. And I think that that's something that in my mind has always been a blurry line between the two. So I like how Mills pointed out the difference between the two. Mills defines data analysis on page 176 as an attempt by the teacher researcher to summarize collected data in a dependable and accurate manner. So that analysis portion is what I'm going to focus on for this screencast, and then I will include my interpretation of the data in a small paragraph when I make my post. So I decided to look at some beginning of the year benchmark data I had for our Go Math program that we use at my school. And what I did, the benchmark obviously encompasses all of the math skills that students will be taught throughout the year in first grade. But what I did with that test was pull out the questions that pertain to our upcoming chapter, which is chapter 4, and all of those questions deal with subtraction strategies. There are only 4 or 5 lessons in that chapter, so it's a relatively small chapter, so there's not a ton of questions in that benchmark test pertaining to that chapter, but I still felt like it was a good formative collection for me and formative analysis for me going into this chapter with my students. So along the top, you can see that I pulled out the questions that deal with chapter 4 skills. I kept the questions numbered as they were within the larger benchmark test because I felt like that helped me keep track of what questions I was actually pulling out rather than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and going on like that. I did code my student data in a manner that would not be possible for anyone else to decode because I did not even write down how I did it or keep track of any of that. I know what system I use, so I can interpret this the way that I labeled my students off to the side here, but anyone coming in would not be able to decode that. So what I did was I had students listed in alphabetical order here when I had started, and I plugged in their score for each one of these questions. A 1, obviously they got the question right, or a 0, they did not get the question right. That's how we are told to score our benchmark test. We are not allowed to give half credit for any questions. It's either they have the question right or they don't. And this is a multiple choice question test that I'm looking at here. So after I had all of my student data plugged in, I went ahead and found their score percentage-wise for each of those for this section of questions. And once I had done that, I could see obviously my students that were struggling and my students that were doing really, really well without having any instruction within this chapter yet. I felt like it was more purposeful for me to organize them by score, so I went ahead and sorted them lowest scores at the top and highest scores down at the bottom, and I think that really helps me look at which students are going to struggle more overall and which students are going to do well overall and possibly need more of a challenge. So at the bottom, I took the average of the answers for that question and got a percentage score. And then I also labeled underneath which lesson that question was pertaining to, because that will help me focus on, it gives me an idea of which questions I need to pay more attention to, maybe spend a little bit more time on that lesson. So that's why I labeled them all. And you'll see there's some repeat strategies down there. So I felt like that gave me a good idea of what lessons I'm going to have to spend more time on and what lessons I'm not, which is great formative data for me going into this chapter. I did notice though that there's several problem solving questions, and I have a lot of varying percentages for those. So like 45% achievement for problem solving in question 16, 70% in question 26, and then 60% in question 38. So that's a little scattered for me, and I think looking at the questions that I have there. This gets a little bit into that interpretation piece, but some of them were more wordy than others. Some were more simplistic in the way that they presented the problem, and some were more complex. So I think that's where that piece comes into it. But yeah, it's definitely good data for me heading into chapter 4. I've never done anything like this with my benchmark data, so I felt like it was very useful for me as a teacher and surprisingly easy. I'm not an Excel pro or a spreadsheet pro of any kind, so I really didn't have much trouble after watching the tutorials, so it's something I could definitely replicate and use again. All right, thanks for watching.